Get her out of here. People like that don't belong in a fundraiser like this. The words cracked across the ballroom like a whip. No one missed them. Not the servers balancing silver trays, not the orchestra tuning their strings, not the 100 guests in tuxedos and gowns. At the center of it all stood Margaret Hale, wife of real estate billionaire Charles Hale, her voice slicing the air sharper than the violins behind her. She didn't whisper. She wanted the entire room to hear. Her diamond bracelet caught the chandelier light as she pointed, elegant finger curled with disdain. Across the ballroom, every gaze landed on a solitary woman in a dress the color of fire, bold, arresting, yet refined enough to hold its own beneath crystal chandeliers. The dress hugged her form without screaming excess, its satin folds shifting with each breath of the room. Her hair was pulled into a sleek bun, every strand disciplined, as if order itself lived in her reflection. Margaret sneered, the corners of her lips trembling with amusement. This is a political gala, not a costume party. A ripple of laughter followed. Some chuckled too loudly, eager to align themselves with power. Others pressed their lips thin, discomfort visible but buried beneath etiquette. The woman in orange didn't move, didn't blink. Her heels clicked once against the marble as she advanced further into the light, steps unhurried, each one claiming the space she was told she didn't deserve. Her eyes, dark and steady, lifted to meet Margaret's. She didn't glare, she didn't plead, she simply looked. And that look was heavier than any outburst, a weight that silenced a nearby waiter mid-step. Margaret's voice rose again. Check her invitation. I assure you it won't be there. Whispers stirred, heads tilted, phones shifted in subtle hands. A young student volunteer near the coat check raised his phone just slightly, recording the tension thickening like smoke. Still, the woman in orange didn't speak. She set her clutch down gently on the champagne table, fingers brushing crystal stems, her movements precise, deliberate. The silence grew so taut it hummed. Then, a new voice broke in, not from the ballroom, but from the storyteller reaching through the screen. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to her. Back to the woman in orange, the one they mocked as an intruder. The crowd thought they were witnessing embarrassment, a guest about to be escorted into the night. What they didn't know, what Margaret herself couldn't imagine, was that this woman held the power to collapse a $3.9 billion political empire. And the unraveling began with 6 words flung like poison under the chandeliers. People like that don't belong here. The room waited for her to shrink. That was the script Margaret Hale had written in her mind. The outsider caught trespassing, cheeks burning, begging to stay. But the woman in the orange dress didn't follow that script. She belonged to another one. Her name was Celine Carter, though few in the ballroom knew it. On paper, she was listed on the donor registry VIP status, table reserved, her contribution surpassing even the host's. But she hadn't arrived with an entourage or a security detail. No flash of limousines, no assistant carrying her coat, just Celine. Alone, silent. Her presence unsettled people for reasons they couldn't name. She didn't perform wealth the way the Hales did, with jewels the size of fists, gowns dipped in glitter, laughter that demanded attention. Instead, she wore her wealth like air, invisible, undeniable, everywhere. A server paused by her elbow, unsure whether to offer champagne. She accepted the glass with a nod, fingers steady, lips curving into a faint smile. Not for the server, not for the room, but for herself. Margaret leaned into her husband's arm, whispering loudly enough for half the table to hear, "She must have slipped past check-in. Look at that dress. It screams desperation." The words spread like perfume, sweet to some, sour to others. A few guests nodded, eager to echo Margaret's disdain. Others avoided eye contact, discomfort tugging at their collars. Celine's eyes traveled across the room, taking in the mahogany podium, the banners embossed with campaign slogans, the discreetly placed donation kiosks. She knew this room better than most. Her signature had unlocked its very existence. She remembered another ballroom years ago, not this grand, but just as gilded. She'd been younger then, 25, attending her first fundraiser with a borrowed dress and second-hand heels. A hostess had mistaken her for staff, ordering her to clear plates from the table. She had complied without protest, cheeks burning, rage buried deep. That memory returned now not to weaken her, but to steady her. She sipped her champagne. The bubbles rose, soft against her lip, as if time itself acknowledged how far she'd come. Across the floor, Margaret raised her chin higher, eager to see the intruder falter. "Security," she said, her voice floating above the string quartet warming up. "I want her credentials verified immediately." Celine didn't interrupt. She let the words hang, let the eyes linger. Her silence wasn't absence, it was pressure. And the longer she stood, unbothered, the heavier it grew. Near the coat check, the student volunteer steadied his phone, recording every glance, every whisper. He didn't know her name, but something in her stillness told him this wasn't the story Margaret thought she was telling. The fundraiser continued in fractured murmurs, the orchestra stalling mid-piece, waiters hesitating mid-step. The room had been designed to showcase power. Tonight, it was about to learn what power truly looked like. The first request for credentials was sharp. The second was colder. "Now," Margaret pressed, her voice carrying like the strike of a gavel. "Check her or escort her out." The head usher, gray suit fitted tight across his shoulders, hesitated. He scanned the tablet in his hand, scrolling through the registry of donors and VIPs. His brow furrowed. He scrolled again. The pause was long enough to unsettle the guests nearby. Margaret's laughter pierced the silence. "See? Not there. I told you." Whispers bloomed around the tables, weaving a net of doubt. "Who is she? Did she sneak in?" Eyes traveled back to Celine, narrowing, judging, some curious, some contemptuous. Celine lifted her champagne glass again, calm as stone. She didn't rush to explain, didn't reach for papers. Her stillness was defiance in its most quiet form. The usher finally looked up, his hesitation betraying him. "I can't seem to find—" Margaret cut him off. "Of course you can't, because she's not supposed to be here." Her voice rose high and sharp, slicing through the quartet's hesitant notes. "This event is for donors, for people who matter." Gasps scattered like beads breaking off a string. A woman at the next table shifted uncomfortably, her husband pressing a hand over hers to still her. The student near the coat check zoomed his phone camera closer. He caught Celine's expression unchanged. Eyes fixed, lips steady. Margaret took a step forward, heels clicking against marble. "Look at her dress, look at her demeanor. Money doesn't buy class, and class is what this room demands." The orchestra stopped entirely. The silence deepened, so dense that the chandeliers seemed to hum under its weight. Celine set her glass down, a soft chime against crystal. She turned not to Margaret, not to the usher, but to the room itself. Her gaze swept across rows of polished shoes and jeweled necklines, across every guest who wondered whether they should laugh, look away, or intervene. She gave them nothing. No anger, no defense, only the kind of silence that forced self-reflection. Margaret mistook it for weakness. "Security," she snapped, snapping her fingers. Two guards moved from the edge of the room, their black suits sharp, their faces unreadable. Celine exhaled once, softly, like a flame bending but not breaking. She adjusted the strap of her clutch, eyes forward, waiting. The air had shifted. It was no longer a party. It was a trial, and every guest had just become the jury. The guards approached, their steps heavy against marble, echoing louder than the orchestra ever had. Conversations froze mid-sentence, forks hovered above plates. All eyes cut to Celine. This was the moment the script demanded. Protest, panic, or a scene ugly enough to justify removing her. But Celine Carter did none of those things. She breathed in slowly, setting her clutch onto the champagne table with care, as though the fate of the night balanced on that gesture. Then she lifted her chin, her eyes calm, steady, impossible to read. The taller guard hesitated, thrown off by her composure. He expected flustered excuses, raised voices, at least a tremor of fear. Instead, her silence pressed against him, as though he was the one on trial. Margaret smirked from across the floor. "Finally, escort her out before she embarrasses herself further." Celine didn't move. She reached for the stem of her glass, swirling the last of the champagne. Her fingers were steady, her shoulders relaxed. Not a flicker of resistance, not a trace of submission. Just stillness that carried more weight than shouting ever could. A guest whispered near the front table, "She doesn't even look nervous." Another replied, "Or maybe she knows something we don't." The student with the phone zoomed closer, heart pounding. He whispered to himself, "She's not afraid. Not at all." Margaret's voice rose again, brittle, sharp. Do you hear me? Remove her." But the guards stalled. They weren't trained for this kind of quiet. Their job was to control chaos, not to dismantle silence. And the longer Celine stood unbothered, the more the room's balance shifted. She lifted the glass to her lips, finishing the last sip. The bubbles fizzed softly, the only sound in a room that had forgotten to breathe. Then she set the glass down with a click that carried like punctuation. Her eyes moved slowly, deliberately, sweeping the room. First to the donors who had laughed, then to the ones who looked away. Finally, back to Margaret. The gaze was not defiance. It was a mirror, reflecting arrogance back to its source. Margaret faltered for the first time. Her hand tightened on her husband's sleeve, her smirk thinning into a line. Celine said nothing, because nothing needed to be said yet. The silence grew heavier. It was no longer absence of sound. It was presence. It was authority. And every person in the ballroom felt it pressing against their skin. Not everyone in the ballroom belonged to the world of tuxedos and trust funds. Near the coat check, almost hidden by a marble column, stood David Ramirez, a 20-year-old student volunteer. His role was simple: guide donors to their tables, collect coats, and disappear into the background. But tonight, he couldn't. From the moment Margaret's voice cut the room, David's phone was in his hand. At first, it was instinct record the humiliation, post it later, maybe go viral. But as the minutes stretched, his recording shifted from curiosity to something else, a responsibility. He zoomed in on Celine Carter. She wasn't flinching, wasn't arguing, just standing there, spine straight, the orange dress flowing like a torch in the middle of polished stone. David whispered to himself, "She doesn't even blink." Around him, other guests noticed too. A waiter balancing hors d'oeuvres slowed, eyes flicking from Margaret's fury to Celine's stillness. At the far table, an older couple exchanged uneasy looks, their laughter from minutes ago drying on their lips. Margaret, oblivious to the shift, doubled down. "Are we truly going to let her disrupt this evening? She has no place here. Not at this table. Not in this world." Her words landed heavy. For some, they stung with recognition reminders of times they'd been pushed aside, mislabeled, underestimated. For others, the cruelty was a mirror they'd rather not face. David's thumb hovered over the record button. He whispered, "People need to see this." One of the guards glanced at him, then back at Celine. The hesitation in the room was growing, a current too strong to ignore. Every second Celine stood silent, made Margaret's rant look less like authority and more like desperation. Celine finally moved, but only slightly. She rested one hand on the edge of the table, the crystal glass empty before her. The gesture was small, but it grounded her, as though the weight of the entire ballroom balanced on that point of contact. The chandeliers trembled above, their light catching in David's lens. He whispered again, almost reverent this time, "She knows exactly what she's doing." For the first time, whispers turned against Margaret. A woman near the front muttered, "This feels wrong." Another man shook his head, murmuring, "It's too much. She hasn't even said a word." The tide was shifting. Not loudly, not quickly, but unmistakably. David steadied his phone, capturing every second. He didn't know Celine Carter's name. Not yet, but he sensed deeply, instinctively, that the video in his hands would outlive this night. Margaret Hale's patience snapped. "Enough of this farce," she barked, her voice ricocheting against marble. "This fundraiser is for serious donors, not imposters playing dress-up." Gasps spread like sparks catching velvet. Some guests leaned forward, captivated by the cruelty. Others shifted in their seats, their discomfort now visible. Margaret took 2 steps closer to Celine, heels clicking like gunfire. "You think a bright dress and a borrowed clutch get you a seat at this table? Look around you. Every person here built legacies. What did you build? A fantasy?" Her words struck the air with deliberate venom. A man near the orchestra whispered, "She's going too far." His wife pressed her lips tight, unwilling to meet Celine's gaze. Celine remained motionless, her stillness almost unnatural. No flicker of shame, no crack in composure. Just eyes steady on Margaret, as though watching a storm beat itself out against stone. Margaret mistook the silence for surrender. "Security," she snapped again. "Do your job. Remove her before she embarrasses herself any further." The guards hesitated. They weren't sure what embarrassed who anymore. The woman in orange exuded something they couldn't name, and the longer she stood, the more it spread. Margaret scoffed, her voice dripping contempt. I knew it the moment I saw her. Wrong dress, wrong face, wrong world. The cruelty landed heavy. A murmur swept the crowd, some disapproving, some complicit, but no longer indifferent. David, the student volunteer, zoomed closer, capturing every frame. His whisper barely audible over the silence. This is history. Celine shifted at last. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hands on the table behind her, grounding herself, claiming space. Her gaze swept the room, meeting eyes one by one, holding them until they flinched away. The chandeliers above trembled as if echoing the tension. Every crystal drop seemed to vibrate with the question hanging unspoken. How much further will this go? Margaret raised her voice to a cruel crescendo. You don't belong here. You never will. The words landed like a gavel, but in the pause that followed, the room's judgment didn't fall on Celine. It fell back on Margaret, her arrogance loud, her fear louder. And Celine, still silent, still steady, allowed it to hang there, her composure turning Margaret's cruelty into her own undoing. Margaret Hale's voice cut through the ballroom like a blade unsheathed. Escort her out, now. The command rang with finality, the kind of tone used to end negotiations, to silence opposition. Two security guards stiffened and moved forward. Their black suits blended with the shadows, their footsteps echoing like a drum roll of judgment. The room held its breath. Celine Carter didn't flinch. She didn't even turn her head. She stood anchored, the orange satin of her dress glowing under chandeliers like fire refusing to dim. The silence around her was heavier than any protest could be. Margaret advanced, diamond heels stabbing the marble floor. "Do you hear me?" she hissed at the guards. "Remove her before she poisons this evening with her presence." Gasps rippled. The word hung foul in the air presence, said as if it were contamination. Guests shifted in their seats, no longer able to disguise unease. A senator cleared his throat but said nothing. An heiress dropped her gaze to the tablecloth, ashamed by her own silence. The guards reached Celine. One extended a hand toward her arm, hesitant but obedient. Cameras tilted. Phones lifted higher. Every angle in the room now pointed toward the center of the storm. David Ramirez, near the coat check, whispered to his phone, "This is the moment. She's about to be dragged out." His hand trembled, but he didn't stop recording. Margaret leaned closer, her voice pitched loud enough for all to hear. "This gala is for people who matter. You are nobody." The cruelty detonated in the air. It wasn't just insult, it was exile, meant to erase. Celine finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, she shifted her champagne glass aside and placed her clutch flat on the table. Her hand lingered there, steady as stone, as if marking her ground. The taller guard hesitated again, unnerved by the calm radiating from her. "Ma'am," he began softly, but Margaret cut across him with a shriek. "Don't address her. She doesn't deserve the courtesy." The words sliced deeper than any gesture. Even those loyal to Margaret stiffened. A ripple of shame passed through the tables, sharp as the clink of a dropped fork. Celine's eyes lifted, not to Margaret but to the chandelier above, as though measuring the weight of every gaze pressed upon her. When her eyes returned, they didn't hold fury. They held patience, sharpened into something unbreakable. And that patience, utter silence in the face of humiliation made Margaret's rage look less like power and more like desperation laid bare. The guards froze. The crowd leaned forward. Every second stretched, taut as wire, waiting for the snap. The silence was seconds from snapping when Celine Carter moved, not with panic, not with protest, but with precision. She slid her clutch closer, unlatched it with a click that carried across the still room. From within, she drew a slim phone, black glass gleaming beneath the chandelier light. The gesture was unhurried, deliberate, like an artist preparing a final stroke. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing? Calling for help?" Her laugh was brittle. "Do you think anyone here will save you?" Celine didn't look at her. She tapped the screen once, twice. No frantic swiping, no fumbling. Just a short message typed with surgical calm. "Execute." The word left her phone in silence, but its weight rippled far beyond the ballroom. Somewhere outside these gilded walls, engines began to turn. Systems hummed awake. Screens lit up in offices where Celine's staff monitored the arteries of power, the flow of money that kept campaigns alive, that bought seats at tables like this one. Inside the room, Celine placed the phone face down beside her empty glass. Then she folded her hands gently over the clutch, as if she had merely adjusted a detail of etiquette. The guards hesitated mid-step. Something about the gesture unsettled them, though they couldn't explain why. It wasn't defiance. It was confidence, anchored and immovable. David Ramirez caught it all on video. He whispered, "She just did something. I don't know what, but—" His voice trailed as his camera focused on her stillness. Margaret scoffed loudly, desperate to keep control. Pathetic, playing with her phone like a child. Remove her already. But Celine's calm was contagious. Guests who had laughed minutes ago now leaned forward, whispering to each other. "She's too calm. Why isn't she afraid?" one murmured. Another replied, "Maybe she knows something we don't." The orchestra remained frozen, bows poised above strings. Even the chandeliers seemed to tremble less, as though waiting. Celine lifted her gaze, not to Margaret but to the crowd. She let her eyes rest on each cluster of faces, one table at a time, like a judge acknowledging a jury. The silence was no longer defensive. It was offensive, an assault of composure against arrogance. Margaret's voice faltered. Her command had not been obeyed. The guards shifted uneasily, and the woman in orange hadn't said a single word. The counterattack had begun not with raised fists, but with a single message already rippling through a 3.9 billion system beyond the walls. The guards stalled at the edge of the marble floor, caught between Margaret's fury and Celine's silence. Then Celine moved. Slowly, she lifted her phone again, this time not to type but to cast its light upward. On the far wall, a screen flickered, the same one reserved for donor acknowledgments and campaign highlights. The projector came alive, names scrolled in silver against black, and at the very top, larger than all the rest, one line glowed. Primary benefactor, Celine Carter, $3.9 billion contribution. The room inhaled as one. Celine didn't announce it. She didn't need to. The truth was displayed in pixels and light for every guest, every waiter, every guard to see. Margaret froze, her smirk dissolving into disbelief. No, that's not—" She stumbled, gripping her husband's arm, her diamond bracelets clattering. Gasps swelled into murmurs, murmurs into a low roar. She's the benefactor? The entire campaign? All of this funded by her? Celine stepped forward, no rush in her stride. The orange satin of her gown shimmered like a flame advancing into darkness. When she spoke at last, her voice was calm, clear, resonant enough to still the room. "Before you escort me out, perhaps you should ask yourself a question. Who paid for this evening? Who keeps these lights burning, these banners printed, this campaign breathing?" Her words didn't rise in volume. They didn't need to. They were heavy, like stones dropped in water, each one rippling outward. She paused, letting silence sharpen her point. Then, "I did." The sentence landed like a verdict. The guards stepped back instinctively, as though pulled by gravity itself. Guests looked down at their plates, ashamed of their laughter minutes ago. A senator's jaw slackened. A socialite covered her mouth with jeweled fingers. Margaret's face drained of color. Her authority, once unquestioned, cracked audibly in the hush that followed. You're lying," she hissed, but the screen above betrayed her. Celine Carter, primary benefactor, $3.9 billion. Celine's gaze swept the room once more, slower this time, savoring the silence that had flipped against her accuser. "You told me I didn't belong, yet this entire room exists because of me." Her voice lingered in the air, undeniable. The reveal was complete, and for the first time that night, it was Margaret Hale, not Celine Carter, who looked like an intruder. The silence after Celine's revelation was not gentle. It was crushing. The names glowing on the screen loomed above everyone like a new ceiling. Celine Carter, $3.9 billion contribution. Guests shifted in their seats, the weight of truth pressing into their shoulders. A senator near the front tugged at his collar, sweat purling along his temple despite the cool air. His wife whispered, "We laughed. She heard us." He squeezed her hand, but his eyes stayed fixed on the tablecloth, as if shame were stitched into its fabric. At the donor tables, conversations fractured into frantic murmurs. How could we not know? All this time she was the one? We sided with Margaret. Their voices trembled with guilt, panic, and dawning fear of consequences. The guards stepped back fully now, no longer approaching Celine. One cleared his throat, almost apologetic, retreating toward the wall. They had been minutes from dragging her out. Now they looked like men who had nearly dragged their careers into ruin. Margaret Hale staggered. She clutched at her husband's arm, searching his face for confirmation, for denial, for anything that might undo what was projected above. But Charles Hale's expression was stone, his lips pressed so tight they whitened. He didn't defend her. He didn't move. He simply stared at the screen, the truth undeniable even to him. Margaret's voice broke. This can't. She can't. Her words dissolved into fragments, the polished cadence of a socialite unraveling into stammered disbelief. Her diamonds sparkled under the chandelier, but no one looked at them anymore. No one cared. The orchestra lowered their instruments, bows resting uselessly against strings. Even the chandeliers seemed to dim, the room folding inward on itself. David Ramirez zoomed in on Margaret's face, recording every crack of her composure. The phone trembled in his hand, not from nerves, but from awe. The bully just lost the room, he whispered to himself, and everyone knows it. Across the tables, a ripple of realization spread. They had laughed at the wrong person, mocked the wrong woman, chosen the wrong side. The shame was collective, a tide none of them could escape. Celine stood unchanged in the center, silent, still. The storm she endured had turned, and now it tore at her accusers instead. Margaret's knees wobbled. She sank into a chair, her voice barely a rasp. Charles, do something. But Charles Hale didn't, couldn't. His empire was suddenly tethered to the woman in orange, and he knew it. The collapse was complete. The crowd was no longer judging Celine. They were judging Margaret and themselves. Celine let the silence breathe for one last moment. Then she stepped forward, her heels steady against the marble, the orange satin of her gown sweeping like fire along the floor. When she spoke, her voice was calm, unhurried, but every syllable struck like a gavel. Effective immediately, she said. I am withdrawing my $3.9 billion contribution from this campaign. The words detonated in the air. A collective gasp surged through the ballroom, followed by frantic murmurs. Someone at the back whispered, without her, the campaign is dead. Another muttered, that money was everything. Celine continued, her gaze locked on Margaret. Every banner in this room, every meal on these tables, every chandelier burning above your heads funded by me. And tonight, I am done funding arrogance. I am done funding hate. She reached for her phone, tapping once. A ripple of notifications lit across the screens of her staff outside the ballroom. Accounts froze, transfers reversed, power retracted at her command. Margaret staggered to her feet, desperation cracking her voice. You can't, this is years of work, you'll destroy everything. Oh. Celine's eyes were steady, her tone unshaken. You destroyed it yourself, when you decided humiliation was entertainment. Her words landed heavier than any shout could. The crowd turned fully now, no longer pretending neutrality. Faces once smug with laughter now burned with shame. Heads shook. A senator's wife whispered, she's right. Charles Hale tried to speak, but his voice faltered. Celine, perhaps we can... No, Celine cut in, sharp as steel. I don't negotiate with disrespect. Not in business, not in politics, not in life. The chandeliers glowed dimmer, as if bowing to the shift in power. The orchestra lowered their instruments completely. Silence, thick as velvet. David Ramirez's phone shook in his grip. He whispered, she just ended them. Right here, right now. Celine turned, letting her gaze sweep the room one final time. Let this be clear. I don't shout to prove my worth. I don't beg to belong. My power doesn't need your permission. Her eyes cut back to Margaret, who stood pale, trembling, her empire crumbling with every second. My money, my decision, my verdict. The words echoed under the chandeliers, final and irreversible. The punishment had been delivered not with fury, but with precision, and there was no appeal. No one moved. No one breathed. Margaret Hale stood frozen, her diamond necklace trembling against her collarbone, her lips parted in disbelief. She had built the night to showcase power, her husband's, her family's, her own. But power had shifted, silent and unstoppable, to the woman she tried to erase. Celine Carter turned her gown, a flame trailing across marble. She didn't hurry. She didn't need to. Each step away from the podium, away from the chandeliers, was its own declaration. She was in command of the room even as she left it. The guards lowered their eyes as she passed. The orchestra, though silent, followed her with reverence, bows resting gently against strings. Guests parted, chairs scraping softly as they gave her space. No one dared block her path. Margaret whispered hoarsely, "You can't just walk away." But her voice broke, weak against the hush of the crowd. Celine paused at the double doors. For the first time all evening, she turned back. Her gaze cut across the room, not cruel, not vengeful, but unyielding. "I didn't come here for a fight," she said, her voice calm, carrying without force. "I came here to witness, and what I saw was enough." Her eyes lingered on Margaret, then swept the room. Dignity doesn't need volume. Justice doesn't need applause. Power doesn't need permission. The words fell like stones into water, rippling outward until the silence hummed with them. Then she turned and walked through the doors. The satin hem of her dress caught the last shimmer of chandelier light before vanishing into the corridor beyond. The ballroom remained hushed, every guest pinned beneath the weight of what they'd seen. Phones buzzed quietly, messages spreading, recordings uploading, history already rewriting itself in real time. David Ramirez lowered his phone, his heart racing. He whispered to himself, "The world will know. Tonight changes everything." Back inside, Margaret collapsed into her chair, her diamonds meaningless now, her empire already hollowing. Around her, guests shifted uncomfortably, no longer allies, no longer admirers, just witnesses to her undoing, and above them all the screen still glowed, refusing to let anyone forget. Celine Carter, $3.9 billion contribution, withdrawn. The story had closed, but the message remained, etched into every silent face in that hall. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She didn't raise a hand. She simply stood, endured, and chose her moment. And in that silence, she proved what they never wanted to believe. Her dignity was untouchable, her justice inevitable, her power undeniable. Fade to black.